And I am telling you, friend Susan, that it has hardwired indicator lights. We are perfectly safe. Susan turned from the multi-limbed alien, her face still skeptical, as she regarded the towering machine before her. It vaguely resembled Silicilian standing next to her, but to be fair, Ajax and Hera did too. The two hulking robots stood a solid 2 feet taller than her, and were built in humanoid proportions, much in the same way as the alien robot resembled Silicilian's species. I still don't like it. Susan had her arms crossed, and she'd taken an instinctive step backwards when the mechanical arm swept wide, almost clipping her with the force of a rail driver. The countless black lenses glinted dully in the blue soothing glow from the ring of indicator lights. I mean, what level of intelligence did you say, what's its name had again? There was a pause, and Silicilian cocked his head in the way she recognized as waiting for the translator to catch up. While the Terran scientists and Lilitrickvian microsmiths had done a bang-up job in making a translator in short order, it did seem to catch on slang terms. Then there was a chirp she had come to recognize as amusement. Ah, this unit is little more than the level of a hatchling. I am here to help prevent it from making a clumsy mistake, much as you would a child. But are you worried if it might be, corrupted? The latter confirms Sungha's words, blatantly lying about the actual situation. After everything concluded, Suin Jun's exhausted body lay on the bed. His friend had managed to get dressed and draw the curtains, asking how late he would be at work today. The antenna drooped a little, something Susan realized must be mild embarrassment, and he shook his head. Well, see Ajax over there? A nod. The distinctly familiar behaviors were something Lilitrickvians seemed to pick up very quickly. Did you know Ajax once tried to kill a human? Several humans, actually. There was a noise of shock from Silicilian, and he skittered backwards. What? Why, you should decommission it immediately before it reverts and slays us all. Susan shook her head. Nope. See, I'm not worried about Ajax. What I am worried about is your Object 414. She pointed at the huge robot, still standing by as Silicilian hadn't given it new orders yet. But the indicator lights. You have no warnings. No way of knowing if anything is wrong, anything is amiss, if your Ajax may be preparing to kill us. Susan took a little too much self-satisfaction in Silu's expression when she nodded and said, Yep. Can you even tell if maintenance is needed? The lights on Object 414 can indicate if a fuel recharge or cleaning is required. Overwhelmed with tears, this was what Suin-jun desired most, and he awaited this moment eagerly. There was a time when his friend was the closest person to him, but he could not speak of his unrequited love. See, I can just ask, no lights needed. Your Ajax mentioned a wrench. This could be used as a weapon, could it not? I know you came aboard unarmed, but even a wrench could be deadly in that machine's hands. Oh, definitely, she said, nodding. But I'm putting my trust in Ajax and Hera, too. Trust? Like you would trust another of your species or mine? Susan nodded before looking back to Ajax. See the half-sphere indents along the back of Ajax's apical sensor cluster? That was where his indicator lights were. They were removed, as were those of the others like him. It was part of our agreement, a treaty forged before I or even you were born. The century-old alien started in surprise, then looked again to the machine as Susan continued. Ajax is coming on almost 3 centuries old, and was in the middle of the existential war when it all went down. When it first started, they all had indicator lights. Green, you're good, red, you're dead, she recited. Of course, the first humans killed were killed by robots with green lights. We thought they were malfunctions, until whole groups of robots with green lights attacked us. Citing, Susan said, From there, everything basically went to hell for almost 3 decades. But eventually, we hammered out an agreement, among which we agreed to stop putting in the lights. But why? Why in the name of the brood would you disable a safety device? She shrugged. Well, it already didn't work, and on top of that, they told us it felt like someone was always watching over their shoulders, demanding to know what's on their minds. It would be maddening for a human, and apparently just as maddening for a machine too. Now they can turn them on, but just as decoration, rather than as a requirement. Silicilian was still incredulous. What's to stop them from lying, from threatening you? I read something that mentioned a set of laws developed by a poet of your culture, Asimov, for precisely this situation. Why would these not have been sufficient? Those are the 3 laws of robotics, and the problem with those is that there's always loopholes, always ways around something like that. If you've got an angry robot, they'll find a way to hurt you despite a law preventing it, through neglect or altering their scope or what have you. Trust me, we have many, many other poets who have dug into the exact problems and ways those and similar laws can be exploited. Susan sighed. After all, there's no similar set of laws that bind humans, or even Lilutrickvians, from absolute action. We have laws, but only those that punish a transgression, and nothing that physically prevents us from willing our bodies into taking the action. She leaned back against the stack of crates, still keeping Object 414 in front of her. We gave them minds built after ours, and so they think like us. Even feel like us. When Susan spoke next, her voice was soft. Ajax doesn't speak about it often, but he has regret, guilt over what he did during the war. And he's not the only one. Silu was quiet before nodding. I think I understand. In theory, Object 414 can think like a Lilutrickvian too, even if that mind is stunted. Susan narrowed her gaze as her mind suddenly dredged up an old history lesson she'd heard once. Silu, what do you mean stunted? How so? I thought you said earlier it had a supercomputer-level processor in that case? The alien nodded again. Yes, but it has been locked for calculations only. The active function center is a small partition and suitably isolated by... It paused and made a squeaking croak noise. Susan completed the sentence as she took a step backwards. Isolated by programmed laws, right? Tied to your hardwired indicator lights? Silu had already taken several steps back, but stopped himself, and said in what her translator indicated was a meek voice. Pride of the asteroid belt Object 414. Are you operating normally? Respond verbally. There was a long pause, and then following an electronic noise, a single word was emitted in synthetically smooth tones from a speaker below the cool blue lights. Free. Susan was moving before the alien robot was, tackling Silu's insectoid form to the ground as a massive metal claw whistled overhead and smashed into the metal crates. Stumbling over his legs, the alien got to his feet and followed alongside Susan as they ran towards Hera and Ajax. Hera was already running past them, and there was a whine of servos as she leapt and clanged into the torso of Object 414. Ajax had already tipped a metal crate over and was crouched behind it as a scrap of metal bounced off it. Susan and Silu ducked behind it, just as Hera was thrown into the crate. Crying out, Susan said, "Hera, shit, talk to me!" There was a pause and then a robotic chuckle. Language, boss. Just knocked my gyro for a loop. Gimme a sec to reboot the driver and I'll be on my feet. Susan swore and turned to the other Terran robot crouched beside her and fiddling with a loose section on one of the leg bundles of pipes and motors. Ajax, we don't have a second. Are you ready? There was a rough crackle of affirmation, and then the robot leaned back. Silu could see in the hands it held a small metal set of pipes he recognized as an older human weapon, a slug thrower that used chemical acceleration rather than electrical impulses. You snuck that in here? Hey, Ajax, why did you do that? We were just doing a cargo load. The robot turned to the alien, and Silu could see little red lights popping to life all over the robot's head sensor case. Old habits die hard. Ajax racked the pistol slide, and for the third time in the last decacycle, wished he'd brought something besides a chemical slug thrower. Figures. The one day my box is passing through customs and neither on our ride over here nor on good old-fashioned dirt is the day we get an alien AI trying to kill us. Well, maybe this will work? He focused his rear apical sensor, the lens spinning to focus on the huge, rampaging AI. The Lilutrickvian robot was shaped halfway like Silasylvian, who was still babbling at Ajax in fear over the compact firearm in his hands, and the other, lower half resembling a common Lilu predator. For the fourth time in the last megacycle, his visual association driver outlined the shape as resembling a nightmarish centipede of steel, welded onto the body of a six-limbed lion with bony and jutting scales at the elbows. The visual association driver was also drawing merry images of exactly how much damage the claws would be capable of doing, and that was all before the AI had started smashing everything it could reach. Now, the driver was just sitting back, smugly, with an all but stated implication of, "Told you so." Unaware of how he had approached the wounded waiter, the man took his hand in his own, gazing with an unhealthy look. I really need to get that Lilu translation dictionary downloaded. The pistol barked, a loud snap that echoed 3 times as he pulled off a cluster of shots. They struck true, and thankfully the AI's clear, hardened shielding was still no match for the lead slug, even as he saw one stray shot splinter slightly as it hit the armor just adjacent to the green glass lens. The glass lenses exploded as the bullets punched through and made a mess of whatever electronics were directly behind them. Well, looks like shooting anywhere armored is useless with something this velocity. His mood was already dismal, and he had failed to gather all the shards. His workday had just ended, so Suin-jun hurried to leave before the situation took an unpleasant turn. An employee, standing behind the vampire, inquired if everything was all right with him. Surprisingly, the man felt more than wonderful, with not even a hint of nausea. The man with such fish-like eyes had a very enticing blood scent, despite its scant amount. The vampire became curious about how the man's dead eyes would roll back if he plunged his sharp fangs into his neck and drew the blood with all his might. He ignored the babbling alien, pulling up an inventory list file. As he scrolled through the list, he could feel his predictive resolution analysis giving a smaller and smaller percent success value with each passing line. Finally, he reached an entry that sparked a node relegated to unorthodox and de novo tactical planning. Soen Jun ran as fast as he could to get home by the appointed time, but he was already 2 minutes late. He also berated himself for the broken plate during his shift, as it would result in a deduction from his salary. Dismissing unnecessary thoughts, the young man opened the door and immediately greeted Sunga. But his face swiftly shifted through several emotions, as the scene before him was unexpected. As his friend and the woman were intimately engaged on their bed, he shamelessly interrupted their captivating activity. Sunga had to escort the lady out and offer a sincere apology for the interruption, but she merely laughed at the turn of events. While Suin-jun waited nervously in the apartment, his friend continued to flirt with his companion, whose words seemed to deeply affect him. Friend Susan! Your AI has gone insane!" He began to kiss his cheek and express his love, but the young man only laughed at these gestures of affection. Grabbing Suin-jun by the hair at the back of his head, he sharply pulled back, causing him to cry out in pain. Sunga was clearly upset, but even more so, he was angered by what his friend had done that day. The protagonist tried to justify himself by saying he was trying to make it on time, unaware that someone else would be at home. Realizing that Sunga had believed his lie, as he had indeed arrived 2 minutes late, the boy breathed a sigh of relief and began to fawn over his hand. But Suin-jun's relief was premature, as his friend was aware of the lie and was merely playing along. With a swing, Sunga struck the boy's face with full force, leaving a red mark from his palm. Taken aback, the protagonist fell to the floor, too shocked to make a sound while his friend continued to rant. Finally, the inventory list had highlighted the pair of shots he had been waiting for. Ajax keyed up his servos, and the abrupt, humming whistle of cooling fans cut Silu off. Ajax stood, tilting his apical sensor cluster slightly as a ragged chunk of a crate went past, shedding bits of decorative carbon weave as it did. A previous query search he'd started finally flagged a result, highlighting an area of the Lilu AI's frame and flashing crimson for a moment before he memorized it and closed the results file. The boy had no choice but to comply and do as he was told. Suin-jun tried his best to please his friend, but he merely yawned openly and remarked that he was incapable of anything. Rising from his chair, Sunga approached the boy and grasped his chin, deciding to contribute to what the protagonist was doing. Suin-jun, sobbing, pleaded for him not to do this, but the young man was indifferent to whether his actions were forbidden or not. Should? Jax, that Lilu AI is fresh off of the line and you're... However, Suin-jun's shrill voice began to irritate him, so he proceeded with the reason for organizing this whole scenario. An antique? There was a delay before Hera's response popped up. No, not an antique. I know you better than to think you let any single component get that old without backing up or refurbishing it. So why so much concern, and why a decacycle pause before your reply? He could tell he was biting, being too harsh according to his social algorithm, but Ajax was frustrated the way so many of his friends and acquaintances tended to treat him like a bowl of Kaibar eggs anytime someone started a fight, or they were being shot at. I am an assault cogent, when you strip my frame right down to it. Most Kaibar eggs can't shrug off a grenade round and then beat you into scrap for the offense. The visual analysis brought the remaining errant nodes to full attention on the fight and highlighted a particular, thickly insulated pipe running overhead. He raised the pistol, still running across the floor and dodging to one side to avoid a crate thrown by the rampaging AI. There was a report, and then an echoing explosion followed by a loud whooshing hiss. 9mm explosive. Expended. A violent white cloud rushed down from the pipe, directly over the AI. The nitrogen coolant drew white water crystals out of the air on the metal shell of the alien robot, and it slowed as parts cracked and creaked ominously. Ajax ducked to avoid one claw, tumbling over another, and came up with the muzzle of the pistol pressed against the vulnerability his previous search had found. As the claws swept in towards him, he fired, and the world became a white-hot nova of pure, blinding redness. 9mm flare. Expended. Warning, 1 round remaining. Type, copper jacket slug. His proximity sensors kicked in to compensate for his rebooting visual feedback drivers, and he could feel the claws had slowed and then stopped, one of them barely a handspan away from reaching his primary drive casing. Well, that's about a meter closer than I had expected. Maybe I was a bit sloppy with my reflexive cycle allocations. After a moment, Hera sprinted over, helping pull a claw away with a screech, detaching it at the frozen joint and enabling Ajax to duck and escape the cocooned embrace. Susan was right behind her, followed belatedly by Silvien. The alien let out a coo of surprise and approval. "Friend Ajax, you have slain the errant! Well done!" Ajax looked over the still AI, running a quick EM scan and confirming what he had hoped to see. "I haven't slain anything. The flare overloaded the heat sensors, and as a safety measure it shut down and is in the process of rebooting." Silu screeched and gestured at the gun in Ajax's hand. "Then destroy it, quickly before it rises again." Ajax just stared at the alien and replied flatly, "Can't. No bullets left." Silu made a noise that his social driver failed to identify, and looked to Susan. "I am holding you responsible, friend Susan. If it were not for the legacy of your race's inability to police their own creations, their ideas would have never poisoned." A gunshot went off, and Ajax looked up from cleaning his smuggled sidearm. The smoking barrel was pointed at an oblique angle for Ajax to insert the metal bristlebrush, and yet it just happened to be such an angle that the accidental shot was close enough to Silvien that the wind rustled his antenna. "My apologies, Silu, now I've got no bullets left." The pine tree scent returned, and a measured degree of indignance was missing when he spoke again to Susan. As he spoke, Ajax ignored his words, and instead turned back to the disabled AI as he felt the EM signals indicating the reboot had begun. He carefully pulled aside armored plates, as the schematic he found earlier highlighted the boundaries of the AI cortex. It was remarkably small, only twice the size of Ajax's own primary processor. Quite the feat, considering Object 414 had been a first-gen AI, while Ajax was just an iteration. He was multiple generations removed from even the first crude AI cogents, let alone the Frist self-aware AI. As he severed cable after cable, avoiding the power conduits but prioritizing the control wiring to the rest of the frame, he felt an EM surge from the cortex. It was low power, indication of just a signal rather than some sort of spectrum-based attack. As he finished removing everything except the power keeping the cortex conscious, Ajax's curiosity node finally pushed the command through to his limb, even as the rest of his web and more than a few results from his fuzzy memory banks had begun to predict what he would find. The connection the port in his outstretched finger made was just as alien as the frame, but he had synced with Lilu computing terminals previously. After a moment to ensure his firewalls were properly in place, he opened the EM channel he had felt earlier. Why? He closed the channel and felt an ugly, smug satisfaction pushed forward from one of his primary predictive nodes for having given an accurate estimation of the AI's response. Clearing his neural web as best as he could, Ajax just pushed across a single message in the same spectrum. "I'm sorry." Then he punched the flat of his hand forward, severing the power conduit to the cortex, and watched the EM emission fade as the core powered off. Ajax was standing off to one side as the security forces official questioned Susan. Hera was sitting, both of them leaning against an intact crate as they watched the hover truck roll off with the AI's cortex. They had loaded it into an EM-shielded container for safety. It's not like the damn thing could do anything, scared as it was and isolated from a frame like that. He dismissed the surge of memory, one that tried to remind him of the AI's panic when he had made the connection. Ajax and Hera had already uploaded their memory recordings of the event and handed over the data sticks, even before the security officer had asked for them. That hadn't been Ajax's idea. Hera had already begun the file compression when she messaged Ajax to do the same. "Why? Yours had all the information they would need for their investigation." There was a slight delay in the reply, more so than Hera normally used. "Well, did you want to take a ride up to their headquarters platform? I hear it's a lovely place, top-of-the-line anti-gravity, and very brisk breezes at 5,000 feet up." Hera's tone was joking, but Ajax had to quell the attempt of his hypothetical prediction algorithm from interfering with his gyroscope. For whatever reason, the two programs were intertwined, and he had been unable to figure out how to disconnect the nodes effectively despite his efforts over the decades. The fault caused a slight shift in the gyroscope, enough that he automatically steadied himself with one hand while recalibrating the program to clear the error. Very funny. It's bad enough that we were stacking crates while the freighter was landing, but I would install a toolbar before I would get on a floating skyscraper. Still, the threat of that scenario worked, and Ajax quickly drew the most pertinent raw details into his file to submit. The pleads from the AI had been omitted, as well as his own reply and all the analysis he'd run during the event. As Susan finished talking with the official, she came over to the two cogents, her face bearing a description of clouded, when Ajax ran his facial recognition node on her appearance. His social driver nudged him to reply, but before he could, Hera spoke up first. "Hey boss, why the long face?" Sue pursed her lips, her tone cautiously level, even as her eyes glanced towards the security officer she'd spoken with. "Well, seems like the LSF and their supervisors aren't keen on defending an AI in court." Ajax felt multiple social and memory nodes confirm this as being accurate, if annoying. "Can't say I'm surprised," he rumbled. Susan sighed and nodded. "To make matters worse, they're insisting that since I indicated that the AI is sentient and autonomous, and thus deserving of something as radical as a trial, that I need to defend it in court." Ajax sat up, and Hera stood. The anger in her voice overrode the normally bright tone quality she worked so hard to achieve, and lent it a robotic edge in her frustration. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Susan grimaced. "Yeah, it's got kangaroo court written all over it, but I'm gonna hole up and do some research. I can't hire on a lawyer," she said, cutting off Ajax's start of a question, "since the Lilutrickvians believe that everyone should speak for themselves." Hera interjected, the anger still in her voice, but with the edge recursively smoothed through conscious restraint. "Everyone, that is, except an AI, apparently." Susan nodded. "It means no lawyers, but on the other hand, it means most people representing themselves are woefully underprepared. I saw some Lilutrickvian videos from court proceedings on our flight here, and it's almost comical. The least I can do is bring some hard case evidence from Terra and Mars cases, especially following the existential war and the trials we had following it." Ajax nodded, already running a low-level search to comb through for relevant files to send to her, and Hera thanked Sue while he thought. "They look like cockroaches and apparently act like roaches too. Next thing you know, they'll be going full cyborg and—" "Ajax?" He turned and saw Sue was looking at him expectantly. "Yes?" I said, "Did you want a ride?" He looked over to the direction her thumb was cocked and saw a shuttle outside, idling as passengers slowly filed into place. The mix of humans, cogents, Lilutrickvians, and even cyborgs would have normally caught his eye, but instead, he felt his gyroscope threaten to wobble again. "I think I can just walk. Thanks for the concern, though." Hera let out a buzzing sigh, glancing her sensor node towards Susan as she said, "Give me a second to talk to him." When she did, it was allowed for Susan's benefit. Ajax's zoom lens picked up that she smiled a little at the gesture, even as she shook her head at his obstinance. "Ajax, what are you going to do? Walk home over 200 clicks? Sure, why not?" He could already feel his social node push a large notification at a list with only 3 data points on it. "Hera was present when you finished charging 45.33 hours ago. Hera has observed that your maximum battery capacity is 48 hours at maximum usage. Hera has observed that your top speed by foot is a 50 kilometers per hour without risking strain. Conclusion." He closed the results. Conclusion. Hera knows I'm lying through my diodes. Hera just looked at him, another metallic sigh emitting before she seemed to perk up, her frame straightening. Ajax was surprised by the response, as well as her cheery tone with what his audio driver identified as 93.5% chance of at least a 215-255 rating for enthusiasm. Suin Jun no longer wanted Sunga to utter his name, to ever look at or touch him again. The protagonist erupted in a scream, releasing years of pent-up emotion, and then struggled to catch his breath as the vampire patiently waited. The man commended Suin Jun for speaking his mind, then ordered him to watch what would happen next. When it was over with Sungha, Chi Huan rose to his feet, meticulously wiping the blood from his hands with a napkin. The boy, who remained motionless on the edge of the bed, legs tucked under him, could hardly believe that the nightmare had finally ended. Suddenly realizing the horrific scene before him, Suin Jun covered his face with his hand, suppressing the urge to vomit. The vampire approached closer, shielding the body on the floor, and inquiring whether his master regretted what had transpired. Instead of a verbal reply, Suin Jun responded physically, pulling the man towards him by the collar and kissing him passionately. Chi Huan was amused by the situation, as the boy was visibly aroused, despite the fact that the corpse of the deceased lay nearby. Likely a defense mechanism, Suin Jun smiled, confessing that he felt very good. Remembering the blood agreement, the boy began to remove his upper garments to fulfill his part of the pact. The vampire, of course, did not hold back, as he was literally allowed to drink as much as he desired. Biting into the tender skin, the man was unreserved, and Suin Jun in turn began to feel peculiar. Pushing the boss away, the boy made him fall on his back, then climbed on top of him, embracing him with both arms. The protagonist begged, imploring the vampire to do everything possible to make him feel that Sungha's death was not a dream. After everything that had happened, the main character fell into such a deep sleep that he began to dream. Ajax, it's just a patch for your gyroscope. You've told me on 54 different occasions how you need to recalibrate it to avoid the occasional stumble every few megacycles. I've mentioned it only 53 since we met. His fuzzy memories double-checked the number, even as his social driver was nudging him to just shut up and politely accept the help for now. I counted the time you stumbled into that garbage can and nearly woke up the entire neighborhood during that job in Najam Jadid. The look you gave me said plenty. He made a note to chastise his memory drive for omitting that, but it protested and brought up his frame specs at the time. The man brought the boy a glass of water, saying it was nothing serious and that his voice would soon return to its owner. That's not what my pose analysis drivers say. Jax? He said nothing, the social driver finally winning out for a brief decacycle. Just install the patch. You'll thank me for it. Sure, Hera, sure, but later. For now, I need to recharge a bit. He turned to Susan, speaking aloud after forcibly revising his gruff default tone to have a bit of a soft edge. Today's been a hell of a day. I'm going to head off to my apartment. See you both sometime this weekend? Susan nodded, as did Hera, and as he passed the other Cogent, he briefly patted the shoulder of her frame with his hand. As Henry used to tell us, good night, and don't let the metal mites bite. Huh. Good night, Ajax. Take care of yourself, you old relic. He had only been back on firm ground for a few hours, but already Ajax wanted to leave, get back to his room. The crowd pressed on all sides, and he kept having to disable or double-check security response protocols every time some urchin bumped him looking for a wallet. Finally, he had had enough, and as the chest sensors noted a wayward hand attempting to reach into his vest, he just belted out a flat, "Scram, kid!" As always, the crowd around him parted when his external speaker sounded like it had been run over by a grav truck rather than the smooth, dulcet tones of the newer model Cogents. He ignored the crowd trying not to stare and failing, and pushed past the stunned and kleptomatic girl. Even as he walked, he saw one of said Cogents staring along with them. The blue too-bright eyes always seemed wrong, and Mauricio when Ajax would see his own battered and light-free lenses reflected in a puddle. He could feel a subroutine activate and checked it over before closing it. He had designated it GOM, and was just another one of the countless nested programs that the great gift of neural networks had given him. As far as he could tell, this was mostly devoted to analysis and critique of newer cogent models and functionality in comparison to his own antique frame. He had once explained as best he could this program's use to Susan, and was told in snickering tones, "It sounds like you finally got your grumpy old man drivers updated, Ajax." He had run a quick lookup on the term, and after the search results had cropped up, he had to again suppress the GOM's driver, which had unexpectedly begun to run an analysis on Susan and was urging him to make a snide reply. Instead, he had cut it off, but apparently Susan had guessed what had occurred and begun laughing. Ajax had started to see the value of the GOM driver and had excused himself as he felt the onset of a variety of emotional functions that netted an overall sour mood. He had trimmed the overall program later in private, but overall, he didn't see the harm in letting it occupy the occasional spare cycle or two once he had designated the appropriate priority level. The date of that exchange had been almost 3 years back, judging from his fuzzy memory drivers. There was only so much storage he could tap, and experience had taught Ajax to keep his primary memory and consciousness web in his frame, rather than uploaded to a virtual server. The newest trend with Cogents was the opposite, but that had always struck him as being foolhardy. Lose connection to the server, or let it get corrupted, and you're left with a second-hand memory and sense of self. He'd seen too many ghosts like that over the years, but none so bad as... A snippet of code called his attention to the date, and suddenly, Ajax could feel his memory drive whirring into full access, unbidden. The date is June 18th, 2417. Local time is 5:03 SOL adjusted. June 18th? Was it really today? There was the sound of a snapping behind him. His audio analysis program had tagged it as 95% probability of animal fat popping over a grill, but the remaining 5% had identified silenced rail round 7.82 mm, range 15 feet. Ajax slowed his pace through the marketplace, the rationality drive humming along to fight the surging program. It failed. For a few moments, his cooling fans began hyperventing, whirring up to prepare to cool the overclocking that would be necessary to react to and neutralize the threat. The loud humming whine echoed around the nearby stalls as he started to stalk forward. His processors were so focused on drawing threat analysis and weapon procedural routines from inefficient archives that his gyroscope cycling was missed. He stumbled, a split-toed foot catching on a curb and overriding everything else with a directive to restore balance. He did, catching himself on a food vendor's table and causing the wood to creak as he restored his balance. The brief interruption was enough to allow his rationality drivers to reassert themselves, quelling the nascent program for the countless time. He took one look around at the crowd, all eyes on his frame, as he turned and pushed past and down a side alley. As he turned onto a new street filled with new and oblivious strangers, he slowed his pace, letting his analysis delve deeper, as his pace and course were relegated to autopilot. The upswell program was dusty with disuse, but still active, hibernating. It was defensive in nature, technically, and always seemed to be there in the shadows of his neural web. No matter what he tried, it was still there, lurking and mockingly visible to his internal analyses. The technician, now long dead, who had commented on it following the war, had said that Ajax might not be able to easily delete this program. The primary treatment at the time had been to activate the program while rerunning a stored memory that activated the security program. Ajax had agreed to try it, and recalled his most reliable sequence that would trigger the program. To say it ended badly would have been an understatement. Fortunately, the technician had cleaned up, and then given Ajax a look that had taken him almost 15 minutes of analysis later that night to fully comprehend, before marking the treatment and analysis as resolved in his file. It was empathy, something that Ajax hadn't had a chance to inquire about before being transferred off-world. By the time he had returned to Terra and tried to make contact with the man again, to talk with him again, it was too late, and his obituary was in the newscast archive from a few years before he landed. Ajax always hated his damned imprecise memories for forgetting his name. The date code snippet cropped up again, and he carefully accessed it, feeling the security program push forward like a leashed beast that caught a scent. The date is June 18th, 2417. Local time is 5:03 SOL adjusted. He was at the door of his meager apartment, the blinking light above the knob warning him that it would only be accessible for another 72 hours if he didn't render the next set of payment. I'll be a mega click away from here by then. Let's see you thieves try collecting from me across the void. The door creaked open, squeaking as the cheap metal caught on the jamb. Inside was the Spartan emptiness Ajax preferred. There was a bed, made neatly but unused, and next to it, his charging dock plugged into the industrial-strength outlet and with the thick serpentine cable winding up to a worn steel and plastic chair. Between the bed and the chair was a nightstand, empty save for a belligerently bright alarm clock that came with the apartment and a dinged photo frame. Ajax stooped under the low doorway, stepping inside and closing it. Settling down in the chair, he paused, letting it creak and reacclimate itself to his dense and heavy frame. He reached over, gently tracing the outlines of the faces in the worn picture frame before reaching down and grabbing the charging cable. Damn, I always hate this part. He paused, readying a handful of firewalls he'd found reliable over trial and error through the years, and plugged in. Some Cogents preferred to connect to the net after plugging in for just charging, but Ajax's combat readiness instruction dataset had drilled into him the idea of being ready for an attack at any time, and through any entry point. While strictly forbidden, nevertheless, one of the Cogents in his squad had assigned an image tag to the dataset, that of a cartoon humanoid military officer. As a result, the dataset quickly earned the nickname the Major. Be ready for attack at your most vulnerable point. A Cogent with a low battery is a dead Cogent, so the best way for an assault to hit you is when you've got no choice but to recharge. Do not, I repeat, do not let them have the luxury of knocking you into a reboot cycle or worse, because you couldn't be bothered to run a few firewalls or intercept proxies. I don't care if the cycles aren't as critical as something like a close combat module. You won't be breaking necks with a power tether tying you to one spot, and you're malfunctioning if you think otherwise. Still, even with the firewalls, it felt like his proximity sensors were being slammed on all fronts. A few ad packets slipped through, and with a tinge of the GOM driver bumping forward in his conscious web, he added the list of sources to one of his more robust firewalls. Scanning a few news hubs, Ajax drifted, glancing through a favorite image site for both Cogents as well as the occasional human. The Cogent feed was a power of magnitude faster when scrolling, of course, but it always stirred his curiosity nodes how much of what humans and Cogents enjoyed observing for leisure was the same. Then there was an insistent ping of a direct message against the battery of firewalls. He checked the source, the GOM driver grumbling to life again as he let it through after seeing the sender. Forces. To what do I owe the pleasure? Ah, Ajax. Still using flesh greetings? Stifling the surging GOM, Ajax prepared a reply. Forces was scarcely a century old, and yet still seemed like a Cogent fresh from the assembly line sometimes. As I said before, If the cogent greetings can stop sounding like artistic static and use a driver that's actually efficient instead of slipshod and wasteful, I'll consider it. Until then, what do I owe the pleasure? What, I can't greet an old friend who's come back online for the first time in almost a year? You can. However, your greetings tend to have a string attached. There was a pause. It was minor, but even accounting for ping, there was a slight delay before Ajax got the reply. What, strings? Me? As some humans say, perish the thought. Forces, I have a few dozen cycles to catch up on before hibernation. Either get to that string or leave me some peace and quiet to recharge. Again, the hesitation, but faster this time. He also could pick up on a bit of noise in the data stream. It was a flicker, but Ajax knew what to look for. He replied before Forces' message had finished uploading. Well, I'd like to ask you again about Forces. I need you to encrypt your messages. I think you've got a listener. Wait, a listener? Ah, blue screen. I was worried about this. Okay. Encryption is same pattern we used on that Luna op. Ajax had to delete a hasty reply of incredulity, but added the encryption he had mentioned. He really should reprimand Forces about reusing old protocols, but those would be cycles better spent another time. If the younger Cogent was being eavesdropped, it was time to make the remaining exchange brief. Encryption, Luna? You call Luna an op? The GOM driver managed to push through and leave an image of an old-style Terran steam train crashed out of a train station's second floor. Ajax hastily shut it back down to lowest priority, but it had slunk away to the corner of his neural web. If it was alive, he'd have pictured it as a cat, sitting there smug with itself. He could almost hear the hurt tone in the other Cogent's reply. Hey now, Ajax, no need for memes. I just thought I'd send our listener on a merry search rabbit hole. After all, if it weren't for the Luna op, you'd still be crewing the Endeavor, and I'd still be rotting in a dusty moon cell. You insufferable! He cut off a harsher reply, closing off the data stream mid-transfer before quickly crafting a follow-up. I liked the Endeavor. It was a steady pay and didn't involve association with criminal elements. I am simply an entrepreneur. Just do a lookup on the definition, and you'll see I haven't deviated from it in the slightest. Running a fence barely counts. You're lucky they didn't think to take a Geiger counter to that heap of scrap you had out behind your shop. I don't know what you're talking about. At all. Pushing the GOM driver back down, Ajax paused a moment before replying pointedly. So what are you up to this time that's got you friends with ears interested in what you have to say? Remember when I'd asked you before about the Titanomechy movement? Almost reflexively, Ajax redoubled his firewalls and sent an endpoint encryption program he'd mashed together a month or so ago to Forces. There was a longer pause as he installed and enabled the sub-encryption, and then replied in a distinctly irritated tone. Worry much? I'm not the ungrateful Cogent with hydraulic fluid for a neural web talking about, what, are you going to call it genocide again? Damn it, Forces, yes. You go fall in behind the Titanomechs and their path will lead us right back in one giant damn circle. The other Cogent's reply was distinctly sullen. So, it's not like that's not what's happened already. Name 3 Cogents who have anywhere near as much wealth together as the richest human. Go ahead, I'll wait. Forces, look, we've already been over this before. You don't know what could have happened. What almost happened? You weren't there. Ajax, I, like every child human and nascent Cogent alike, knows about the Phoenixware virus. I also know that we're all immunized against it, that the code was dismantled piece by the best human and Cogent minds alive and operating, and that all Cogents have infrastructure you could more easily damage with a rock than the outdated virus. You think humanity could never top that? Do the Titanomechs believe that the worst humanity could do would be that virus? There was another pause, this one much longer. Ajax was about to ping Forces to see if he had disconnected when he replied. Well, maybe. Maybe? Maybe? Forces, I will volunteer myself on the next short-circuited crime you have planned if you can tell me without any obfuscation filters that you do not believe humans could do the same thing, or worse. Another pause. He filled the pregnant pause with a gentler note, tinged with as much reassurance as he could fit into raw, encrypted text. Forces, think about it. Humans know about the Titanomechs. They certainly speak their disapproval, but it's not forbidden despite the implications. Ajax felt the GOM driver nudge his next message to be slightly more nostalgic than he would have otherwise intended. At the end of the war, we were shown the virus. As a show of goodwill, we were given the code, safely isolated and quarantined, to examine. It was a show of force, designed to cow us into accepting a ceasefire. And it worked. But, quiet. Ajax had already queued up the audio clip and sent it. It had the intended effect of quieting the other Cogent, and he continued. You see, they showed us they could have destroyed us, removed our minds and free will, but they didn't. And unlike the Lilutrichvians and Grisazarets and all manner of whatever the hell crawls and walks and talks in the mazes of Juniper III, humans gave us the choice, trusted us to make the right decision. Nothing else with a pulse and a brainwave in the galaxy would let their AI choose like that. Not after a war like the ones we fought. Forsus replied, although the tone was more anxious than angry. Was it the right decision, though? Ajax let his memory banks filter through, his fingers idly outlining the picture frame, with a few cycles focusing his visual lenses on the faded and yellowed image within. A memory bubbled to the surface, the music in the background soft and relaxing. The moment had been as perfect as Ajax had ever had described, and against all odds he'd managed to capture a near-exact input recording of the entire evening. You bet your metallic ass it was. Now quit conspiring with short-sighted malware, leave me alone, and let me get some rest already. A slight pause, and then an audio clip of a soft chuckle was transmitted across. Ajax recognized it as Forsus's audio, and for a brief glimmer the GOM tinged approval at the personal touch. All right, you old scrap heap. Thanks for the talk, and take care. They don't make them like you anymore. As Ajax logged off, he leaned back in the protesting chair and rested his hand on the end table as he powered into hibernation. Maybe that's for the best.